Hello everyone. Please welcome our next guest, Tonimir. He'll tell us about exploring IoT attacks. Please welcome.
So, hello everyone. I'm Tonimir Kisasondi and I'll be talking about the exploration of the IoT attack surface. I come from a little town in the north of Croatia called Varaždin, where my faculty where I work is located. And I had the Open Systems and Security Lab there, where we mostly, how should I say, concentrate on the offensive part of the information security business. First, I have to thank my sponsors, usually as it goes. My research is sponsored in part by the Croatian Science Foundation, which is a pretty good deal because we have a research project on IoT security, and they pay for the hardware, which is always cool. If you're interested into the scientific part of it, you can visit iot.foi.hr, which will pretty much take you to our page for the Internet of Things interoperability project, which we're doing with a lot of other things. Security is just part of it. So if you're interested in IoT in research, ping me, we can probably collaborate. So the first question is, which is now, of course, not a good time to ask it, but why should you listen to me and not go for coffee, mate, or beer? Well, currently, there is a large amount of IoT gadgets, IoT things, from Amazon Echo to the next quadcopter or internet-connected buggy, toy, everything that works pretty much on GNU Linux or a version of Android. And believe it or not, we got the 90s of InfoSec back. So it was all like, how should I say, in the 90s we had all kinds of bugs. You can pretty much find vulnerabilities everywhere. You can have that today if you just go into IoT. If you want a official definition what Internet of Things is, well, it would say something like Internet of Things is the network of physical objects, devices, vehicles, buildings, anything that's embedded with electronics, software, sensors, network connectivity that enables to collect and exchange data. Which would pretty much mean that if there is something that people will do, they'll try to connect everything to the internet, including these premium things, like you have toilet seats that have Bluetooth, that are IP connected, so you don't have to press a button, but you can simply swap from using Twitter to use their app, and you can wash yourself, get warmed, get dried, get wiped, everything. It's interesting because it also has a sound module, so you can reproduce music on it. Since it's pretty much IP connected, guess what happens? There are some guys that really bought this kind of stuff, and they started trying to hack it. And they pretty much hacked it to play all kinds of stuff, either stuff you don't want to hear playing when you're on the toilet seat, or simply just spray water at you at random and so on. Well, this is a fun example, and pretty much I don't know how fun it would be if an IP-connected toilet seat assaulted you, but this is a little worse example. So it's from Symantec, because there are Android smart TVs, and guess what? There are people who found out that, well, people will most likely pay a ransom for a smart TV. Why? Because smart TVs are kind of expensive and people don't like using them, losing them. So we have TV ransomware. Next thing is this little thing. I'm not the fitness aficionado, as you can see from me, but I got one of those things just to research what it does, what it has in it. And the interesting part was it has a galvanic skin response sensor, it has a heartbeat sensor, it has an accelerometer. So what it can pretty much say to you is how many steps have you taken, what's your heart rate, how well did you sleep in light sleep, in deep sleep, when did you wake up, how many times you woke up during the day. And pretty much it's interesting because you get your whole biological everything set on your cell phone. So that's awesome, right? So how many of you, when you buy the next cool gadget, connect that gadget to an intercepting proxy to see what does it send and to where? Anyone? So you would say yes, I want privacy, please do not send any data, blah, blah, blah. And what happens is they will send Tonimir Kisasondi, height, weight, born, resting heart rate, heart rate while on like running up the stairs, amount of steps taken. So it's pretty much somebody in the cloud gets your whole biological clock, knows how many times you get woken up in the night, which pretty much means somebody can pretty well have a good guess on how fit you are or how not fit you are. And that's a bad thing if you think about it, because currently it's okay, but if I tell you something like you give them consent for monitoring of data, for selling of data and so on, and what happens is you want to get, for instance, life insurance, and they say, no, you're too risky. Well, fine. But what happens if they have like used something like deep learning, data mining, and figure out that this person might have a stroke in the next like 6 months? You can tell it for certain. And then the insurance company says, yo, sorry, we're canceling your insurance because you're not too risky, but we cannot sell you insurance. Sorry, bye, here's a refund, bye-bye. Then it starts getting really interesting, right? So we have to know that as there was a quote in one movie, I think it was The Social Network, where somebody said that the internet isn't written in pencil, it's written in ink. And that stuff, you buy it and it will collect all kinds of biological data from you. So that's pretty nasty. Second, everybody loves the FBI and every other three-letter agency. What happened was there was like an interesting part where the FBI cannot neither confirm nor deny wiretapping your Amazon Echo, which is a little Amazon smart gadget. So this is kind of concerning, but I was like, nah, this cannot be. And then I was reading my local news, which pretty much said that some guys tried to rob a bank, but they were caught by spying on their smart TV in Croatia. Even more interesting, right? Usually somebody would tap their phone, they would tap their, how should I say, their apartment, but a smart TV is also fair game. When you look at the ecosystem, like the whole IoT thingy ecosystem, you have a thing that's a physical, like a sensor, a probe, a smart plug, a smart light, anything. And it's connected to the network or directly to the internet, or it's usually connected to some kind of a hub. The hub is like a central device that connects all the devices, like all the smart lights in your house are connected to one hub, right? So you can switch on lights on and off via your cell phone and do anything else. There's another thing called, that's usually also a broker. There can be all kinds of communication systems like Wi-Fi, Bluetooth low energy, XB, whatever you want, pretty much. And on network, it's mostly stuff called like MQTT, like message queuing telemetry transport, or Ethernet Wi-Fi, which you all know. If it's a little bit, how should I say, a heavier machine, it will pretty much speak HTTP, so you can know how to use it. And there was a lot of research on IoT security. One of it was done by, I think it was HP and IOActive. I'm not sure, but OWASP IoT Top 10 pretty much gave a list of top 10 like vulnerabilities in IoT gadgets. The first place was insecure web interfaces, because most of that stuff has a web interface, you can manage it, and usually people that write embedded software, that build embedded projects, are not so good of a developer, so they usually have a lot of vulnerabilities in the web interface. Second is insufficient authentication authorization. Usually there are pre-installed user accounts, pre-installed certificates and stuff like that, which isn't helping. Insecure network services, you got, for instance, you got SSL that's old, like OpenSSL, some 5-year-old version, which is pretty much vulnerable to every known and unknown exploit which happened in the next 5 years. Privacy concerns, I just said one, they send everything to the cloud. Insecure cloud interface, this is even better, because usually when you have like a third-party device that somebody is giving you a cloud service for, that cloud interface could also leak data from other people and so on. Mobile interface, we all have mobile phones. Their applications aren't too well built. So instead of having like a small attack surface, you have a big attack surface which covers network protocols, mobile, web, embedded security, everything. And pretty much you have everything that you can imagine from the IT side of the of this world you have in IoT, which means there is a really hard difficulty of trying to set where is the line in the attack surface and what's the line of my system. Does it end by the cloud provider? Does it end in my network? What can happen, right? By the way, if you want to ask a question anytime, you can just visit this link and ask one. In this talk, I will just concentrate on the IoT things. So the gadgets, you know, the ones that we all love. So what's the attack surface? Pretty much you can either attack the thing physically, not by using an axe or a sledgehammer, but you can attack it by trying to get physical access to it and then trying to do something with physical access. You can like try to use physical access to obtain firmware, file systems, images, and you can use that to get to the software and firmware vulnerabilities. If we go from the communication standpoint, the protocols are mostly known. Mostly there is no need for reversing, but you have a lot of radio stuff, like if you have a HackRF, a BladeRF, Yardstick one, anything, you can pretty much have fun with RF analysis. There's a lot of other stuff that we won't cover, which is side channel attacks. Pretty much every device uses some amount of power, gives up some other emission that isn't in its primary like core functionality, which can be used to see or like leak data like keys or see what the machine is really doing. That's some really interesting stuff, and that's a whole nother level of vulnerabilities. The first one is something which covers pretty much software analysis, which we will cover a little bit on the end. But let's see for easy victories. Like you have a device, you bought a device, how can you hack it? How can you do cool stuff with it, right? So the first question is, why do I want to do this? The correct answer is because you can. If you don't have root on your machine, is it really your machine or is it somebody who's lending you the machine, as my friend Dobrica said once? How can you measure if a thing is secure? How do you know if there are any possible vulnerabilities or problems in this? So if you don't take it apart, how will you know? And do we have like a testing methodology for embedded IoT, like a penetration testing standard for IoT gadgets? We don't. So one part of my research is actually trying to create a standard how to break IoT things apart. And the third thing I want to answer is the IoT top 10 relevant? Yeah, sure, but their current status was, I think, 12 or 16 devices, and I think it needs helping, right? First, always, if it's a hardware talk, you need some tools. People think you need really expensive stuff like throwing down thousands and thousands of euros. That's not true. 99% of the things you need is like a multi-tool, a screwdriver or something, and you need a thing called the Bus Pirate. Or if you're feeling really cool, you can get something called Shikra from Xipiter. They both go for $30. They're a universal, like, imagine it, what is a Bus Pirate? A Bus Pirate is a universal communications device, let's call it like that, right? So you can connect it to a device and say, hey, I want you to speak this protocol, like I2C, SPI, whatever. And when you connect to a device, you can pretty much try and do something over that protocol. So it will help you to use, on one end you have a USB and a serial console, and the second one you have your device. You can use the Bus Pirate as an FTDA cable, that's like an FTDA adapter. It usually costs $15, and I'm too lazy to reprogram it every time like a console, so I just buy one FTDA adapter. And if you need probes to just connect to something, you need something called Easy Hooks, which I highly recommend, because if you look at the cheap probes you can buy on AliExpress, they're not as good as Easy Hooks, which you can also buy on clones on AliExpress, which are pretty good. There's a lot of other stuff, like JTagulators, HackRFs, software-defined radios, all kinds of weird stuff, logic analyzers. You don't need that for most of the things. The point is when, for instance, Kost and Dobrica were talking about one part of reverse engineering and hacking, I'm talking about the second part. I'm not really interested to build something like interoperable. I'm interested in getting a shell and getting access to the device and then do something on it, right? So it's not really distinct, but it has some overlap. So what can you do if you hack a device? First, you can jailbreak it. For instance, I have one cool story later which pretty much considers jailbreaking one device, or you can see what's happening on there. What you're searching for? First off, you're searching for either factory set credentials like passwords. You would be amazed what kind of stuff can you find in those embedded devices. Like you can find like default passwords that you didn't know were there. You can just telnet or SSH into a device and you're in, you have a root. But the root account isn't root, but it's usually something like, I don't know, the vendor name plus a prefixed password. Second thing is signing keys and passwords in the firmware updates. You can usually find private keys which enable you to log in on different machines, or you can try and man the middle of those devices without any impunity because you have the private key, because the private key is distributed to the same in the same firmware image and it isn't recreated per device, right? You can have like full access to binaries, source code for web applications, which is great. You have source code for the software that runs on that stuff. It's usually some version of PHP CGI like stuff, or something that's calling pretty much something embedded on this device, which is usually written by electrical engineering developers, not hating on anybody, but the point is, usually all the tech stuff like buffer overflows and every other old school trick you know will work on it. So it's easy. So I have a cunning plan, variant for noobs. First thing you want to find is something called UART. Pretty much it's a serial console on the device. I can guarantee you that most of the devices have a serial console somewhere. You just need to find it. Connect to it. You'll probably, if you just reset the device, you'll get a root shell or a shell of some kind. All you see a boot process. What a serial console does is you don't have VGA and you don't have USB, so you can see what's happening on the device. But the serial console is the same thing. Imagine guys that work with routers, like with Cisco routers, Junipers. When you connect the serial console, you can see the boot process and everything. Same with embedded stuff, right? So how do you find UART ports and serial ports? There are a couple of methods. First one is looking, because they usually come marked. The second one is you can use a multimeter. You can find out which one is the ground, which one is plus 3.3 volts or plus 5 volts. You can see the one that's like has some signal. That's usually the transmit one, and the receive one usually doesn't have any. It's really cool if you have a logic analyzer, like the Salea. Somebody like, I don't know, Kostak Dobrica said something about Sigrok. If you buy a cheap Chinese clone, it works perfectly with Sigrok. If you spend a heap of money on a genuine pro version with 16 channels, it doesn't work on Sigrok. So if you don't need high resolution oscilloscope / logic analysis stuff, just get the Chinese clone version. It's more than enough. There are specialized devices that can find UART ports that will bit bang all the possible combinations and try to see if something is a UART port, like the JTagulator. And I like the audio buzzer method, which means if you find the ground and you find the plus, like the VCC, you just add one part of the buzzer, the ground, onto the ground, and you try picking some pins that might be transmitting data to you. So if they transmit data to you, when you put a buzzer on them, you'll hear noise, right? Because it will change the tone. So if you take a look, you can see here upstairs that in the upper part, there's like RX, TX, 3 volts and ground. That's your serial console. Just solder it on and off you go. This here lower part can be something called the JTag, but you can check it out. You can see, depends on a lot of the devices. Sometimes they'll come with even pre-soldered headers. If you see 4 header pins on a board, you can pretty much bet it might be a serial port. So you don't have to like think too hard to see if it is or isn't. This one is on a Ubiquiti Unify access point, like the ones that you see on the floor. That's their serial console. So you can connect to it, and you can pretty much get a shell on it and then do anything you want in a Linux terminal. Your Raspberry Pi, if you have one, has a serial console on the GPIO pins. So you don't have to connect it via HDMI. You can just simply connect a serial console to it, power it on, and do your config over serial console. It takes some work on Raspberry Pi 3 because it shares the serial console with the Bluetooth, I think, something like that. But you can pretty much manage any Raspberry Pi via serial console. So that's my preferred way of doing it because you don't have to lug around a monitor which has HDMI on it. Sometimes you don't have the 3-volt connection. You have only the ground, the transmit and receive. That's it. That's enough. Those three are minimum. If you see noise and you cannot, if you just connect transmit and receive, and you have to connect them in crossover though, and if you see noise and you can't have anything, any good data out of it, check if your ground is stable. If you have a good ground connection, because if you don't, well, everything is going to be garbled. Sometimes you can find them like labeled as TP in and TP out, and the ground is somewhere else, like on the Ethernet connector's shield. You can grab ground there, TP in, TP out, or transmit and receive, right? So there are serial consoles available anywhere. You just need to look really hard or try them. Usually when you see all those fun little pads, you just try a buzzer on them, and you'll pretty much see if something is buzzing and has noise, it has some data coming out of it. Even better, if you don't have a buzzer, use a logic analyzer or an oscilloscope. They both were great. So you see here, I didn't have a ground, but I grounded it on a USB connector, which is also ground. It works. It's that one is actually a TP-Link mini router, you know. That's the same thing that, as I told you earlier, most routers have serial consoles. You can just connect to them and hack around. And when you connect, you can find all kinds of interesting stuff. For instance, you might have to configure those over a central management system, like a central piece of software that helps you manage all of those access points in the network. Well, if you connect via a serial terminal to them, you'll see that they support something called U-boot. And U-boot, if you know grub from Linux, U-boot is the same thing, right? So if you just check out what's U-boot, you read a little bit of documentation, you'll find out that it's a simple bootloader, right? So what can you do? You cannot break it, you cannot end it, you don't have any other, like, you don't have a shell on this machine. So how do you obtain a shell? Do you remember the old trick from Linux when you just say that your init shouldn't be the kernel but bin sh? So boot me the bin sh. Same thing here. When you see the boot arguments are console TTI 0, you can just simply say, okay, init bin sh, save environment boot. What will happen? Does anybody have an idea? Pretty much that machine will boot into like a functioning root shell, which then you can see like cat etc pass cvd, see what are the possible users on the system, and you can do anything else you want. There is also a cool thing called NAND glitching, which I can explain how it works if we have time on the end. So if you're interested in NAND glitching, how it works, it's not voodoo, it's not rocket surgery, it's pretty simple. If you want to know about, ping me. So, what if you if you don't have a serial console on a device? What else can you do? Well, vendors usually post firmware updates or firmware images on their pages. If you download the firmware image, you can pretty much disassemble it and see what's inside. By the way, when I say disassemble, I don't mean using IDA or Radare or something like that. It's way more simpler. Give me a minute. Plan B is trying to intercept an OTA update, over-the-air update. So it pays to have like packet captures of your test network. When somebody is trying to push you an over-the-air update, you just have the content there. The plan C is you can try to dump the non-volatile RAM in situ. That means from the board you can directly connect to the chip and try to extract all the data out of it. It's still the only thing you need for this is your bus pirate. So it's still under $30. Plan C, you can unsolder the chip, read it in an adapter, we'll talk about it later, Or you can use something like a JTAG to just dump the whole NVRAM contents. Or if it's an AVR like Arduino, there is a command that pretty much does this when you connect it to the Arduino. So how does it look? People will say, yeah, if you want to dump data from chips, you need something like a SOIC clip. That's a genuine SOIC clip, and you connect it to a chip. It will like bite the chip, and you can then have little pins on it, and you can connect any device you want, like a logic analyzer, bus pirate, whatever. Those cost like $30 to $50 depending on the quality. There are low quality Chinese ones for $10, which are, by the way, same thing. But I would suggest you don't bother with them. Just buy a set of nice easy probes. Those are easy hooks. They are tight enough so you can pretty much stack them on any SOIC chip and you will dump data out of it with no problem. So instead of spending money on the clip, just buy some nice probes you can reuse for everything else. You don't have to spend a lot of money. That's the thing down is a bus pirate. It's another clone. I have a genuine, I have a clone. Same thing. Pretty much, how will you find which chip is the NVRAM, the flash chip? How will you find which one has all the interesting stuff? Well, if you just put 25Q12128FVFG into Google, guess what you'll find? I don't know, it's how big of a flash chip. So pretty much using Google on the chips will tell you which one is the flash chip, so which one you can dump. And the interesting part is, if you check out software for firmware dumping, which we'll talk about later, it has the chip numbers in them. So if you just do find on the page, you can pretty much find it. My elite soldering skills can be seen down in the lower part of the image, where I try to solder a JTAG connector to a board which has no true holes, but it has only pogo pins. So I just solder it pretty badly. You can pretty much do any of this not by connecting any headers, but directly interfacing with the pins on the board by using something called pogo pins. If you ask me, I wouldn't recommend it because you have to solder an adapter for the pogo pins, and you have to pretty much make a consistent connection all the time, which get somebody else to hold it because that's a two-person job. And if you think about it, a firmware dump will take somewhere between 1 to 4 hours. So if you don't create a jig that will hold everything in place, you'll pretty much fail on that. So it's pretty much better to solder a header on it. For JTAG, there are various devices like the JTAGulator, which will enable you to find the correct JTAG pinout with relative ease. So if you're interested in that, you can go that route. But I dislike this route. Why? Because first, I think OpenOCD is too much of a hassle. Second, we're searching for easy victories. So what can you do? First one is dump, like as I showed in the earlier picture. You can pretty much dump the firmware out of the chip. Or the second thing is you can try to run it in a virtual machine. So when you connect all of your probes to a flash chip, and you connect them to a bus pirate, there is actually a schematic on the flash ROM site how do you need to connect each pin. With one command, you can pretty much dump the whole flash chip into a file. So it's wait 2 hours and you'll get all the content. So you either have the dumped firmware or you download it from the vendor's page. What can you do now? There are a couple of tools that can help you. First off, some of those images are compressed with either gzip or LZMA. You can use something like binwalk, which will tell you if the image is compressed and will try to decompress it, or use something like Sasquatch, which supports even more compression algorithms. So if you got something really esoteric, Sasquatch can pretty much handle it. Which will happen when you just type binwalk or Sasquatch on the name of a firmware dump. It will give you the offsets where each part starts and the description, what did Sasquatch or binwalk find on that offset. So you can see squashfs file system, executable script, ELF binary, Unix path something, ELF binary, 3 XZ, like that's LZMA, compressed data files, and another package. With binwalk, you can pretty much easily extract each of those parts into a file. So with squashfs, you can do something called unsquashfs and uncompress it. With XZ, you can decompress XZ into another folder, and you can simply check out the file system like you had shell access on that machine on your box, right? So what you're looking for software vulnerabilities, config files. Start with the easy stuff like etc passcvd, which will have all the passwords for the system. Try cron jobs, try web applications. There's all kinds of stuff you can find. SSH keys. Most of the time you can find SSH keys on the machine, so you don't have to bother. There's also all kinds of cool stuff you can find, like private certificates and all other type of stuff. And usually all the partitions, each partition, you can mount them, you can extract them as an image, as a part of an image, and you can mount them to a, normally like you would do with an ISO image on your machine and analyze it. One popular part you want to see and analyze is the init system. Thank God that, for instance, IoT hasn't switched to system D, but we have the old school system 5, right? So one thing you want to see is, does anybody see a problem with this picture? What? Yeah, I created that one, but what's the point? All of them are word readable and writable, and they all get executed by root. So you just edit a file, reboot the machine, and your code, whatever you put in any of those files, will get executed. So it's simple to add a new user to the system or whatever else you want to do. You can even, if you have firmware files, you can modify them and use something like FirmWalker or firmware compilation toolkit that will enable you to create a custom firmware file and then burn it to a device which will have your pre-rooted version. See, a FirmWalker will also search for various other things like default password files, shadow files, configurations. It's a nice thing to use because it will save you a lot of time. Another possible attack vector is what happens when you don't have a flash chip on the device. Another cool thing that's replacing flash chips, for instance, in things like fridges, which this is a fridge that runs Android on it, so God help us all. If you open it up, you'll have an UART shell, which you can connect to, and then you have an Android root shell. Or if you can't find any flash files, try searching for eMMC files. What are eMMC files? Everybody knows like SD cards, right? Each one of us has at least some SD cards. eMMC is pretty much the same thing, but it's not in SD card format, but it's a BGA chip on a board. So those are really popular because you can get them in 4, 8, 16, 64 gig variety, and they can hold the whole Android system. If it runs Android, it probably has eMMC. So what you can do is tap onto the eMMC. An eMMC tap is pretty much simple. You need something called an eMMC adapter. It has a couple of lines. You have to identify the correct lines on the chip, which is the hard part. Why? Because it's a BGA chip. Sometimes you have enough help, so they will come, the tap lines will come marked, so you'll see which one is the data line, command line, voltage line, clock line, and sometimes they won't get marked. So what you can do is, if you have a good veterinarian, which has like a digital x-ray machine, you can probably x-ray this stuff and then see on the x-ray. Or plan B is pretty much, how do you call it, hit and miss. But you can pretty much see which one is the voltage, which one is the clock, which one is the data line, command line, by simply using a logic analyzer. The voltage line will pretty much stay stable, the ground line will be low, the clock line will have a repeating pattern, and then you have simply data and command line. But you'll see the data line by booting has a lot more output than the command line and so on. The other possibility is if you have a good sponsor that's willing to give you 3 or 4 types of the same hardware device, what you can do is pretty much take it apart, unsolder it, unsolder the BGA chip, the eMMC chip out of it, buy a reader of AliExpress. By the way, did I tell you the Chinese are awesome? People always usually hate on them because they break stuff, but you can buy all kinds of cool gadgets from them that really help in reverse engineering and breaking stuff, like eMMC adapters. You unsolder the chip, pop it in, power it on, and you have a mass storage device. So you have full mass storage access, and you can pretty much read the whole thing as you would a memory stick, right? For instance, there are a lot of other vectors you can use, and all of them, as you see, all of them are pretty simple. It's usually just that it's not really rocket surgery. Another possibility you have is like the Ubiquiti routers, like the edge routers. They have a USB stick on them. So if you take them apart, you'll see a USB stick on them. And if you try to look it up on your system, you'll see it's actually Linux, and it's actually Viata. And guess what? There are good people from FreeBSD that created an image which you can boot off tough router and have FreeBSD on it. There's also all kinds of interesting stuff. If you have like a USB stick, you can edit that file system, and you can add anything you want into the PSSVD file. You can reverse it, you can have fun with it. Like the same thing with the Chromecast, right? They have eMMC, and they have a lot of other pads that you can pretty much see if it's a serial terminal up there or not. One other cool thing is, for instance, when we're talking about Chromecast, its micro USB port, which is for power, isn't only power. It's an micro USB on the go. So you can boot out of it. So you can pretty much, if you have a Chromecast, you can boot out of it. There is a lot of stuff about it, like check out exploiters.rs. There are exploiters.rs. They have all of that stuff documented pretty much. There's a lot of cool attacks you can do if you just try to think what did the developers think and how do developers bootstrap those devices? How do they get code onto them in production, right? And now people will say, meh, hardware hacking, I like software. Is there something I can do from the really script kiddie side? Remember the OWASP top 10, IoT top 10? Which was the most common vulnerability? It was insecure web interface. And what do you think what's the most common vulnerability in IoT if we check the web interface? It's command injection. Why? Because usually you want to have a web interface that's lean, and you want to execute small binaries on the system, right? So what every developer does is they create like a binding that will execute a system binary with some arguments, which any developer knows will lead to command injection. The idea is simple. One thing I like to do is when I have gadgets lying around, is connect them to an intercepting proxy and connect them to an access point that I control. And first, crawl the web interface. Second, use a web vulnerability scanner with a really slow rate and leave it overnight. And in the morning, what you'll find is all kinds of interesting stuff. One of that interesting stuff is pretty much you can find always at least 1 or 2 remote code execution vulnerabilities, command injection vulnerabilities, all kinds of interesting stuff. Let's not talk about XSS. That stuff comes in heaps. But here's like one interesting thing I found for this little device, which is an IP-connected power socket. You have command injection on it. So why is this useful? Well, this vulnerability pretty much helps me to create a curl command on my terminal. So when I say like living room light off, pretty much exploit a vulnerability to turn off a small lamp in my room, which I think is cool, but it can be practical, but it can be also very interesting to see that developers didn't run a simple vulnerability scan against their devices, because if any of you is a web developer, you know that vulnerability scanning is something like totally basic. We're not talking about penetration testing or any other, how should I say, complex methodology. We're saying about trying the lowest hanging fruit that doesn't require any intelligence to do. And you can still find a lot of vulnerabilities with that. So should you really care about it? Okay, it might be cool to, each time you want to turn on and turn off a lamp in your living room to exploit a vulnerability, that might be cool for you, but should you care? Well, remember the smart fridge, remember the smart connected light bulb, remember the IP connected toilet seat, everything's going on IP, right? So we pretty much are putting devices into our networks which are built by, let's say, the lowest bidder, and God knows what they send out to the internet. Usually all kinds of stuff. There was the IR connected USB to IR thingy. It sends data to China, God knows what. But if you think about it from an attacker's perspective, the IoT devices are the perfect implants you need in the network. Why? First, they're the ideal pivot point. How many times do you think a smart bulb gets rebooted? 0, until you screw it out. How many times does this smart plug get rebooted? Only when I pull it out of the wall, right? So all of these devices are permanently connected, and the worst thing is they're in our network, they're on Linux, and as you see, any kid can exploit them. And the first thing is you hack one of them, and now I have, for instance, this is an exploit that will work against any of them. Even the data center connected IP PDUs, like power distribution units, where you connect servers, the same exploit works on the single one that costs like $60, and the same one works on the rack-mounted ones. So pretty much that's a small problem. And remember how Hacking Team got hacked? One thing that was interesting to me, I like the most favorite thing I like reading is forensics reports. Either the hackers bragging how they hacked something, because you know you can learn a lot out of those reports. So there was one guy who hacked Hacking Team. His pseudonym is Phineas Fisher. I don't know who he is, but you have him on Twitter. You can follow him. One thing he wrote in his post was something like, "And 0-day in an embedded device seemed like the easiest option. And after 2 weeks of work reverse engineering, I got a remote root exploit. Since the vulnerabilities still haven't been patched, I won't give the details." What happened was, he did his recon. He found that in their publicly facing part of the network, they have an embedded device. It was, I don't know what it was. It was never given in the clear, but he could identify what kind of a device it was. He bought a couple of them on eBay and started reversing them, and he found a vulnerability that he used to pivot into their network. How many times does an embedded device get rebooted? Very rarely. And there, as you see, even the big ones get hacked with embedded hardware. When you start some lateral thinking, pretty much when you have LAN access, you get owned. Even worse if it's a Windows domain. I don't know how many of you played around with hacking the Windows domains, but there are also all kinds of interesting things you can do. You can poison requests with responder and pretty much get hashed credentials out of boxes. You can man the middle, like ARP poison the whole network. You can try to poison updates with backdoor factory. You can inject stuff into unencrypted web pages and pretty much get take over a control of a certain tab on the net of a guy that served a page unencrypted. So it's pretty scary to think what can happen when your attacker has LAN access. When something has LAN access, you're done. You're owned pretty much, because it's not hard to escalate unless you really hardened your network. So it's pretty much write once, deploy your malware everywhere, because all of those vulnerabilities are pretty much reusable. You get one of those devices that is cheap, and you can pretty much own all of them when you find one vulnerability. So what do we want to say? The Internet of Things is coming. From a security perspective, we're not ready. And everybody loves their IP-connected fridges. Everybody loves all kind of IP-connected stuff, and I'm pretty much scared of it. Well, the second cool thing is own some of the stuff you own. Like, you'll be really happy to see what happens in your network. And before buying, inform yourself if the vendor did some of the mortal security sins. Just Google, for instance, if you want to buy, let's say, a connected bulb for light, Google like security, vulnerability, hack, root, something, and you'll find all kinds of interesting stuff. You'll see that people do data exfiltration out of smart light bulbs. Who would have known? So what's the moral of this in open source? Well, if you develop free open source software, take note. Because if any vendor decides to lock a device, like lock it so you cannot root it, jailbreak it, something, if you have physical access, it is way more easier to get that data. Open by default is broken. We should build security into the stuff we develop. Each one of you works somewhere. Most of you, because you're interested in this, you work mostly in IT or in connected areas. People should get more knowledge. It's not really knowledge, and not everybody should know how to hack stuff and get root on boxes, but they should be aware of the risks. If you're aware of those risks, you can make more sane decisions. So use your brain, think, and stay safe, right? So I'll take questions if you have them. You can use the URL, or you can just simply use the live one. I'm fine with the live stuff. Any more questions? Don't be shy. So, if there are no questions, you can ping me. Jelena told me that I should tell you that now is the official workshop, Drakia workshop. It's in the lounge area. So by the invite of the BalCCon organizing team, see ya, and thank you.